great pleasure to continue in our chain of distinguished speakers. I'd like to get people from the very frontier of computers who can actually tell you about how it happens. It gives me great pleasure to have Dick McKinnon come visit. Dick has been a visitor here at the University of Maine for, well over 20 years. For a long time, University of Maine. People here in the Computing Center actually played a key role in the development of some of the features of IBM's operating system, so this was involved at an early stage. But today, Dick is going to talk about a topic dear to his heart and to the hearts of many, and that's the evolution of the IBM personal computer. In his capacity as chief head of the IBM Cambridge Scientific Center, which was located in Tech Square, just right adjacent to MIT, did a lot of early development work for the personal computer and other IBM computers. At one point, he was head of all the IBM scientific centers. So here's a guy who can really tell you a lot about how this all happened. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dick McKinnon.
Thank you. I have a disclaimer, or I should reveal something about my bias. I guess I did spend 30 years at IBM, and I retired in 1992 on time and happy. But I did spend 30 years there. And I must tell you that since the day I left on July 2nd, 1992, I have not used a mainframe or a time-sharing system. All of my use of computing has been with personal computing. And I haven't missed what I left behind, even though I loved it. And now that I'm retired, I get to spend full time whacking away at my glorious personal computer. After I left, I continued teaching, but I also did consulting, and one of my clients was EMC, as I told the class this morning, and they were the founder of that company, and the chairman was my client, and he gave me something that would hang in his office and every other office in EMC. You knew that at IBM there were think signs, and that was something to make fun of after a while. But at EMC, this is the sign that hung in all the offices. So I took one of these with me, and so I spent 2 years watching EMC, trying to figure out what IBM was all about, and I tried to help them understand that, but I'm not sure their version came out the way mine did. But it was an interesting time. So I've really kind of subtitled my talk, the PC, is it the Garden of Eden? Because in many, many people's minds who had been involved with computing beforehand, indeed, the thought of it or the advent of it, they did liken to the Garden of Eden. So we'll try to come at it from that standpoint. But I'd like to set the scene a little on how the PC got born and what the environment was. And when I say PC, I'm being, I guess, arrogant enough to mean as in IBM PC. I'm going to talk about Apple and some other machines, but what I'm going to focus on is the IBM PC, because that's become an industry. The other machines are machines, but I'm not sure that you would call them an industry. And before the PC, in much of computing, IBM dominated. And indeed, there was one school of thought that said it was a monopoly, and IBM on 2 occasions was sued by the US government for antitrust violations. But before the PC, IBM's dominance and predominance in computing was in the mainframe area. And some of you know what mainframes are, and some of you don't. But basically, the mainframe was a one-stop shopping type of operation. And to pick on IBM, IBM provided the mainframe. It did all the engineering, all the manufacturing. Nothing was subcontracted out. All the operating system was written within IBM. There were no third-party software vendors, and every stick of it was done in-house. And that's why IBM came to be called Mother IBM. Some people thought that was a warm, friendly reference, and others thought it was sort of a way of sticking it to IBM. And in computing, there was a guild. It was a closed shop. Very few people were involved until fairly late in the game. There was very little formal academic training in computing. It was on-the-job learning. But in the end, it was very much a closed establishment aimed solely at the professional who made their livelihood there. And the thought of having the casual person on the street, much less your mother or grandmother, involved in computing was totally unthinkable. And as IBM went ahead, it found itself in the later 1960s, let's say, it found itself somewhat puzzling in that it was becoming irrelevant in some marketplaces or in some places, and those were primarily university campuses, academic environments, technical computing establishments like federal laboratories, if you will, and people that basically had problem-solving needs and were not commercial business enterprises. As the years rolled on, IBM found itself very much irrelevant and out in the cold in those marketplaces. So here on one hand is a company that's thought to be dominant and is all over the place, and on the other hand is completely frozen out of a certain segment of computer usage. And to kind of get at that, we should note that this is the 40th anniversary of the IBM System 360, and I guess the start of this phenomenon of IBM becoming irrelevant to some people starts with the 360 because a basic fundamental decision was made with the 360 to go what I'll call the one-size-fits-all mold of computing. Here's a single architecture, a single systems design, many models, different price points, and as the years rolled on, there were any number of different models. But all the dogs were expected to eat out of the single bowl. And some decisions were made that I think were unfortunate, but they were consciously made to make the machine attractive to business users, but not to technical or scientific users. So to pick some examples, in looking at data formats, the 360 used what's called an EBCDIC format instead of ASCII, the ASCII byte versus, if you will, the EBCDIC byte format. In computation modes, instead of using the IEEE standard for floating point arithmetic, there was the, quote, IBM standard. It was like, meeting in a phone booth and deciding on a standard. And things like that went on that in the end sent a powerful message to scientific and academic users that said, they're not interested in us, and as much as I'd like to, I can't use this because I can't get the kind of precision I need in my computations. So as time rolled on, the System 360, which Fortune magazine called a billion-dollar gamble, became enormously successful as a commercial business product and was a total flop as a technical computing thing. Okay? And three basic phenomena started taking place almost from the instant the 360 was born, and those were the growth of the supercomputing industry, the rise of companies whose forte and sole marketplace was problem solving and technical computing. And probably the most significant example of that was Control Data, CDC, which made machines that were targeted at the high end of the scientific computing arena, and that kind of segued into Seymour Cray's enterprises out in Chippewa Falls, Minnesota, and the rise of Cray supercomputing. And that phenomenon, in parallel, another one arrived, and that was a change in the modality of computing towards interactive computing or time sharing. Time sharing. As somebody said, it's the multiple use of humans by a single machine. And then finally, another phenomenon emerged, which was mini computing. Now, IBM was not insensitive to the fact that these things were going on, but in the end, in some cases, their response was concern, and in other cases, it was a big yawn. In the case of supercomputing, IBM's response was to start cranking out more powerful models of the System 360. But because IBM controlled the entire development of those models, their gestation period was horrendously long, minimum of 5 years. So they would announce a machine, and then deliver it perhaps 5 years later. And the feeling was that worked a terrible hardship on companies like CDC, and in the end CDC brought suit against IBM saying that they were paper tigers and IBM was trying to stick it to them. In the case of time sharing, IBM was humiliated to find MIT starting Project Mac, a very widely publicized interactive computing time-sharing project, and selecting General Electric Company, GE, as the hardware vendor for the time-sharing system that was developed at MIT called Multex. And IBM's reaction to that was first to pout and fume about it and stamp their feet and say, we'll never give any more money to MIT, and then every year they'd give them $50 million, and so what's the message? But the reaction was for IBM to decide to enhance the System 360 in the form of something called System 370, and one of the main differences is the System 370 had virtual memory or dynamic address translation on it, and that was a direct outgrowth of the time-sharing phenomenon and what had been invented at MIT. So we could say IBM came very late to the table, and I'm not sure you could say it won the time-sharing derby, but it certainly won the virtual storage derby, because System 370, which was announced in 1970, became equally as successful as System 360 did. As far as the mini computer, that was the DEC thing, and it was kind of dismissed as a freak show. Not to worry, they're just little things, and who's going to do serious computing on them? And of course, when the phenomenon called Unix arrives on the PDP, that's dismissed as a DEC thing also. I spent a lot of time with IBM executives, and they could not understand that DEC did not invent Unix, but it came from somewhere else, and they ought to think about that. So that was kind of IBM's response, but the plain fact of the matter is that it was, by the end of the 1960s, pretty well frozen out of the serious computational game. And then finally, one more thing appeared on the horizon, and that was the advent of the microprocessor. And again, the microprocessor didn't get too many people's attention. It was very small in its capacities and its power and its software. And it was thought that maybe it was something for embedded systems or that could squirt gas into your carburetor, but what did that have to do with serious computing? So not to worry. So the conventional wisdom is that IBM missed the boat on microprocessors. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think it did. IBM had microprocessors coming out the gazoo. The problem was how it went about it. It understood that microprocessor control of function was an advantage and something to be desired, but the problem was each product house and each engineering house and each laboratory and each plant site all developed unique proprietary microprocessors that were their own, and there was no sharing in the corporation or leveraging of that investment. So there was no notion that the microprocessor would become an internal part number, if you will, in some people's lexicon. And so while microprocessors were sprinkled throughout IBM computers and boxes, that fact was not advertised. In fact, it was hidden. And in fact, it was hidden from the rest of the company in most cases. And there was no leverage of that particular phenomenon, with one exception, which I would like to talk about briefly because it has a lot to do with the birth of the PC. And that's in the late 60s, IBM formed a new division called the General Systems Division, and it was targeted at selling to the small customer. The feeling was the big blue sales force had gotten to the point of feeling very comfortable with the Fortune 500s of the world, but didn't know how to sell or talk to small fledgling companies. So the General Systems Division was started, and they had a small business computer with a small punch card with round holes in it called a System 3, and somebody in that division visited the sister center to mine in Palo Alto, and they saw the prototype of something called SCAMP. And SCAMP now sits in the Smithsonian in their computer exhibit. And the people in Palo Alto convinced the General Systems Division, I don't know how, but they convinced the General Systems Division that they ought to adopt SCAMP and turn it into a commercial product, and that way they could go to small engineering companies, if not college campuses, and they could sell personal and portable computing. And the General Systems Division did that. And in 1992, they invented, they announced the IBM 5100 portable computer. So what was it? Well, first of all, it was microprocessor driven. The processor, the engine, was an internal IBM proprietary 8-bit micro called the Palm processor. And what else was it? It offered built-in an APL and a basic language interpreter. Okay, if you wanted to use the thing, you could write programs in either BASIC or APL. And it had a keyboard, and it had a display, and it had a cassette storage, and eventually it acquired a disk and an ability to communicate. So lo and behold, this thing was unveiled, the 5100 portable computer, and I sneaked one out the back door and kept it. And it's been in my basement ever since. And this is what it is. I don't know, this is 3 or 4, 5 inches at the most. The toggle switch tells whether you want to be in APL mode or basic mode. It's got a Cadillac keyboard, storage, all that you could want. Okay, tape storage. And when it finally acquired a disk, the disk drive was almost the size of that, even better, right? And if you want to communicate, here's an acoustical coupler. You can just stick your telephone in and dial up a computer and do time sharing on it. Now, the question is,
the best part is its weight.
Weight.
Oh.
45 to 50 pounds. 45 or 50 pounds. The IBM Portable Computer. $20,000. $20,000. And if anything, the price went up as you started. Oh, there was a dot matrix printer also, which was the size of this. Okay? Well, the long and the short of it is it sank like a rock to the bottom of the ocean. It was a horrible, horrible commercial flop. And even though it was innovative, and even though it was totally untraditional as far as IBM's standpoint, kind of an arrow shot into the sky, IBM, you would think it would at least profit from the insight and the understanding it would have acquired in terms of marketing these or using them or whatever. And in fact, a lot of IBM people internally who were junkies on APL loved it because now it was their APL. But in the end, it was a commercial flop because, number one, as you can gather, it wasn't portable. Number two, the people selling it, the General Systems Division peddlers, they knew nothing about problem solving, knew nothing about APL, didn't know BASIC, and it was sort of like, if you want to order it, come and get it and bring a truck. Okay? So IBM's conclusion was that it was akin to putting your hand on the stove. The mantra that came out of that whole thing was not, we got to do it better next time. It was never again. Never again. So people backed away, and that was the end of about 1972. That was the end of personal computing in IBM. Well, now at this very time, there are all sorts of other things going on. The Commodores and the Altairs and even the Apples of the world are getting born, and people are starting to show interest in them, and people are starting to work on things, and people are starting to fall in love with it. But officially, IBM had no interest whatsoever in all of that, and if anything, kind of thought it was, in my favorite expression, was a freak show and not serious industrial strength computing. Nonetheless, experimental work was going on, and I'll just give you one example of that. As a result of all of my travels through universities and seeing what was going on, we felt what was called, or what we call, an intelligent terminal would be attractive, where you could do actual computing on something that had a display and a keyboard and had computational capability. But there was a lot of concern about storage and disks and downloading of stuff, and how would we do that and what would we do. So at one point, working with the University of Waterloo, we commissioned this thing, which you would connect an ASCII glass teletype terminal to, and out the other end of it, it went to a server. So if you will, in today's parlance, this was a thin client method of computing, and this was actually implemented, and it had a networking capability, local networking. Went into an IBM mini computer, a process control computer called Series 1. And so in conjunction with the University of Waterloo, we built that and started carting it around. I also had an IBM fellow that worked for me that designed something called Pee-wee, which I did not bring because I couldn't find it. But it's in an aluminum suitcase, and it was the computer in the suitcase, and it truly was portable. It probably weighed 10 pounds, would slip under an airline seat. And this IBM fellow, Nat Rochester, the inventor of the symbolic assembler, would take it around, set it up on an executive's desk, dial up a computer, and work with it, and then the executive would smile, and he'd leave, and the grass would grow. Nothing ever happened. But I tell you all this because there was, within IBM, a fervor that said, you know, there is something to this personal computing, and that was partly born out of time sharing, which, if you think about it, is a form of personal computing done large. And by that time, time sharing had become perfected and so reliable that people were entrusting their entire intellectual work product to that mode of operating. They just craved for better bandwidth, primarily because of graphics, and a desire to free themselves from the glass house, the computer guild, right? I love what I'm doing. I just want to be done with the Jerry Dubays and the Jay Johnsons and the Bill Sullivans of the world. And this is where we get into the Garden of Eden analogy. And also going on at this time of the, if you will, the birth of the micro-based system in various places like Commodore and Apple, there's something else going on within IBM executives in that they are continuing to get beaten upon as they visit campuses. Almost every IBM executive was on the board of some college or university, or was head of their alumni association or whatever. But in the end, IBM had become viewed by academic houses as employers or charitable benefactors, but not a force in computing. And in fact, you could say that the only logo on campus in those days was on the electric typewriter in the dean's office. So IBM, I think, did a very open-minded thing, and that's took a very hard look in the mirror, because it decided that computing on campus and in laboratories was a hearts and minds issue and problem. We just weren't there. And if we didn't get there pretty soon, we ain't ever going to be there. So in 1978, a task force was convened at Armonk by the chief scientist, Louis Branscombe, who was my boss. And from that hard look in the mirror, which basically told the IBM chairman, what they told you at Caltech last time you went out there and got beaten upon is absolutely true, and we are irrelevant, and unless we do something, it will get worse if that's possible. And the IBM personal computer was a direct result of those experiences. So there's some things that I think you should know about the IBM personal computer that was introduced in August of 1980, which will kind of set the scene. First of all, it was uniquely IBM. The forces that said, let's do an Apple clone, were rebuffed. And it was decided to design and establish a uniquely IBM product that was a clone of nothing, a fresh sheet of paper, which was a very, very interesting thing to be done. Now, why do you think there was a large force within IBM that said, let's do an Apple clone? What would be the rationale to that, do you think? Ride on the devil's coattails. And what that reflected was a reality that in IBM there was no consensus whatsoever on what people wanted personal computing for or what they would do with it. And indeed, I attended session after session in Armonk where the conversation, it would always start with, we're thinking of investing a lot of money. Pardon me. Tell me what people are going to do with this again. And, you talk about Fortran or you talk about BASIC or something like that, or students. And then the next thing you know, you'd hear about, my wife probably would keep her recipes on it, or maybe my slides, maybe my 35 millimeter slides. Remember that? Maybe I'd catalog them on something like that. And people say, wait a minute, this is IBM. We don't do slide catalogs and recipes. Is that what we're going to do? So in the end, there was no unanimity other than the clone approach was rejected. And secondly, I think it was the closest thing IBM has ever done to taking a flyer. It was, let's do it and put it out there and hope that it will further our cause on campus and that the IBM logo will appear on campus. And that's indeed what in fact happened. And then some other, I think, very fortunate things happened. There was a brilliant mandate that said, okay, we're going to do this, but do it in 1 year, start to finish, from the day we walk out of this room. 1 year from now, we're going to have a commercial product announced. So rapid development became the name of the game and a new trick within IBM. Keep in mind, we've been talking about an IBM where the average gestation period of an IBM computer was 3 to 5 years. Okay? So what was done to achieve that goal? Because it was achieved. And first of all, a new business was established. Brand new business was established. A new campus facility was set up in Boca Raton, Florida. It was deliberately kept apart from mother IBM. That was not an accident. It was set off separately. It was given the closest thing that's ever existed in IBM beside the IBM fellowships to a blank check. All the developers ran out and got Apples, and they all had Apple computers sitting on their desks. And in effect, they shunned the IBM candy store of technology. And what they recognized, and I think in good fashion, was time to market was the game. One thing to have a personal computer project, but if you couldn't have it within a year, you'd be irrelevant and forget it. So as a result, all the hardware, with the exception of these succulent keyboards, came from outside vendors. Keep in mind, IBM not only invented the hard disk with the RAM-AC, it invented the floppy disk. Okay? It had dot matrix printers for eons. It knew how to make displays, in its sleep. And none of that, except the keyboard, came from IBM. Same thing with the software. All from outside vendors with two exceptions. The BIOS, which was written in-house, and the full duplex ASCII communications package that came with the PC was done in-house in my laboratory. And I had to beg them. I had to make myself thoroughly obnoxious to be able to get the IBM personal computer to communicate on day one and to have a software package. So in the protocol was the enemy's full duplex ASCII. And the reason we did that was we wanted the IBM personal computer to be able to communicate to non-IBM computers. Non-IBM computers. And in my view, that was one of the happiest decisions that was made. And a complete 180-degree turnaround on another matter. It was an open machine. No trade secrets. No yellow and black signs. No rings, no watches, and deadly force authorized. Keep out. None of that. Okay? No alterations in attachment bulletins that the customer engineer would wave at you if he caught you opening the covers of the machine. And as George reminded me at lunch, there was a tech manual that thick which spilled the beans on everything. Even the BIOS, printout of the BIOS was in there, and the BIOS was not patented or anything like that. It was copyrighted. The only intellectual protection applied were the licensing agreements on the software packages and the copyright on the BIOS code. So this was not only a 180-degree turnaround. Keep in mind, this is the IBM that had vowed in 1964, after the 360 cliffhanger, to become a risk-adverse company. No more billion-dollar gambles. And that was Thomas J. Watson Jr.'s, the leader of the enterprise. That was his judgment about System 360. In retrospect, it was a fantastic success. During the process of its unveiling and development and delivery problems, it was hell on wheels. So the fact that the IBM personal computer in 1980 appeared and was born, I think, was a tremendous testimony to the greatness of the new IBM generation that had succeeded Thomas J. Watson, because he was largely exiting or had exited the company by then to become ambassador to Russia, I believe. Yet at this very time that IBM was preparing to wheel out the personal computer, and it did it with all the flair and panache and glitz that you would expect from an IBM marketing company. It was a tremendously attractive and successful rollout, which got very high marks. At that very moment, IBM was preparing for failure, was dreading the whole thing. So you hear people talking about putting your game face on and going out and doing it. That's what IBM did. It thought it was about to uncork one of the biggest fiascos in business history. And to its utter amazement, the reception it received is what you know. You know what a success it became, and it just astonished IBM executives. But as I'll talk a little later, and I think as we'll see, IBM either never learned the lessons of the PC, or it quickly forgot them within just a few years. And in my view, the PCAT marked the end of IBM leadership in the PC arena and probably can serve as its high watermark. So the PC, once it came out, the industry speculation was, what's next? And what's next was something called the PC Junior. And the PC Junior was interesting because it had an infrared keyboard. That was a first. Gee, that's interesting. And it was physically smaller and lighter. The PC wasn't that heavy, but the PC Junior was much lighter. But it had a quirky keyboard. And the only way I can describe it is the keys were described as chiclets, as in gum. And people found it impossible to touch type on the thing. And it was a complete flop. So, what to do? Well, then it was decided, let's revisit student computing. And there was an IBM executive who was very prominent in the affairs of the Harvard Business School. And he, I think, convinced the Harvard Business School to become the guinea pig for the next IBM Portable Computer for student computing use. A computer you could take to the classroom and use. And lo and behold, here it is. And it's called the IBM Portable Personal Computer. And it does have the F keyboard, the original keyboard, and it has a orange on black display. And, whoa, it's got disk storage, just like the original PC. And in fact, it largely is the original PC, with the exception of the color of that. And I weighed it before I came here, 31 pounds. And so there are these pathetic pictures in IBM's Think magazine of students on my alma mater, I might add, lugging around this thing. And they're all kind of like that, okay?
Students have to be stronger.
Right. and there were fewer women, I suppose you're going to say.
No.
Well, in any event, it sank. It followed the 5100. And indeed, it was another year or two before IBM had anything that resembled a laptop. And indeed, my IBM fellow, Nat Rochester, went to Boca Raton and spent over a year there and helped them at least get a high-quality laptop-type keyboard. And I think that particular, in the succession of IBM laptops that have come along, they seem to have gotten that one right. But all I'm suggesting is, almost from the first model, as things went on, IBM started losing its way in this particular arena. And in fact, Boca, that strange business within IBM that was off campus, if you will, that was brought back into the IBM fold, and the IBM PC, more than anything else, became a business personal computer. Now let's talk a little about what happened after 1980 when the personal computer was announced. And I'll refer, really, my view of what happened is it was the Garden of Eden version 2 with modifications. And the question is, what can we say, pro and con, about what happened after the introduction of the personal computing, looking at personal computing apart maybe from what IBM did, because it became an industry. It became a whole thing, and the clone thing had a tremendous impact. And IBM's reaction to that was to go back to its old ways, to have a proprietary system, to, if you will, instead of having an open system and let everybody compete and the best person win, IBM pulled back in, kept the cards close to its vest, and its PS2 and what followed has proven to be commercially unfortunate and unsuccessful, to the point where IBM is pretty much out of that business. But what we can say about the whole personal computing phenomenon in industry is its overwhelming achievement is its ubiquity. Hundreds of millions of people use them. Business, commerce, the home, education, the military. Rivaled probably only by the telephone or the TV or the typewriter, has anything made of metal like that achieved such ubiquity. And the control of it has passed from the guild to the civilians. Somebody said from the monastery to the sinners. And it's become the prime vehicle for communications in many parts of the world. This isn't a talk on the internet, but let's observe that the internet really is a PC thing, not a DARPA thing, and not a computer science thing. So the personal computer has become the great catalyst, the facilitator, and the lubricant for change, both in matters human and technological. And indeed, I think there's an interesting book that speaks to this, and it's called The Death of Distance. And indeed, for examples, all we need look, given where we are today, at the University of Phoenix phenomenon, and we'll see that, in fact, the internet has been the proverbial gasoline poured onto the fire. And there's been an enormous ripple effect from the PC to the other modalities of computing. The workstation and the server have changed forever how scientific and technical computing are conducted and how industrial strength information systems are achieved. Just think of what Big Blue is made out of, or any supercomputer these days. In the hardware revolution, whether it be the large RAMs, the larger disk capacities with smaller form factors, and on it goes, all of that has bled outward from the personal computer and affected those other modalities. And cheap cost and high quality come together in this realm. And the PC is really a rare example of that. And in many people's view, that phenomenon alone, cheap cost and high quality, qualifies it for the Garden of Eden point of view. And we have heard that there's something called the digital divide, but I'll say the have-nots are catching up at a torrid pace, and users are now freed from the guild that they had come to hate. So what IBM viewed as a freak show has become a freak show. And one person's definition of Eden, I guess, is the ability to live my life as I want to, not as somebody else thinks I should. So there are many, many pluses, and you know and have lived many of them, so I won't belabor all those points, but I do want to also maybe take some time to reflect on what I call realities and qualifiers. there's a need for some perspective, I think, and cause for reflection on what's happened. In my view, there's been a fatal defect in the personal computer, and it's what I call the eyeballs and fingers thing. The eyeballs and fingers thing, because the PC was born as a literal personal system. In the rush to creation, the persona that got stamped on the PC was there's going to be a human being there to look at a display and to touch the keyboard. And that was baked into the operating system, which became MS-DOS. Okay? And if CPM in Digital Research's offering had been selected versus MS-DOS, I believe the operating system would have had a different mentality and would have been built on more modern computer science or any computer science, and there was a chance that the personal computer would be just something that happened to be fairly small and fairly lightweight and might have a human being staring at it or poking it at a keyboard. But that wouldn't necessarily have to be a presumption. But alas, in fact, it didn't turn out that way. So we're saddled with what I call the Listerine effect with Microsoft. We hate it twice a day, and yet we love our dog. And that's what many, many people are stuck with, and that's really what has become synonymous, the so-called Wintel system, if you will. But let's not forget that there are hundreds of millions of folks who are using Microsoft operating systems, and the horses have been not only led to water, but they're drinking. The dogs are consuming this brand of dog food. But I think we also ought to recommend that many are captive or de facto or default users with no choice or alternative, and where there is choice or alternative is where we see interesting things to happen. But largely, I view it as what I call the Listerine effect. Now, when you think about what's happened in the years since the PC came out, you can say, what's the problem? As when I would talk to the EMC folks about what might replace the revolving disk, the rotating disk, as I told the class this morning, the standard answer would be, what's wrong? Haven't you seen our numbers? It's not broken. Why should you ask us to consider fixing it? And indeed, that's a point of view, $53 billion in cash sloshing around in a tank at Microsoft. Not bad, huh? But what can we say? And I think we can say the problem is not that there hasn't been progress, because I think a fool would argue that there's been no progress, but what I'm concerned about and lament is the glacial pace, setting a low standard and inhibiting progress. And this even got Microsoft indicted. Read the Justice Department complaint against Microsoft in its antitrust suit, and you'll see inhibition of progress in the field is one of the items in the Bill of Particulars. And only in April 2004, after $1.6 billion has changed hands, has Microsoft gotten around to making nice with Sun Microsystems. So progress has been dismal and meager and niggardly. That's in the dictionary, by the way. And the prevalence of whim and caprice has bothered a lot of people. The takeaways, the step backward and the half step forward as each model of or version of Windows takes place has bothered a lot of people. So people are bothered, and I am, by what I think is the indifference to what the dogs are eating and whether they like what they're eating, and lack of concern about what they should be eating. But haven't you seen my numbers lately? Take a look at what computing was in the 1970s and 80s and what has endured out of that. And I would suggest that Microsoft, which spends $6 billion a year on research and has a research organization of world-class academic computer scientists that it has lured away, I would suggest they do well to revisit the playbooks of yesteryear and steal everything they can from the good ideas and maybe get their operating system up to snuff. Microsoft bought their computer science research talent, and IBM grew theirs. And computer science and innovation show in IBM, and I think has been its rescue, and I can't really see where it shows or has shown at all at Microsoft. I really don't think the $6 billion really show at all. So maybe it's a matter of degree, or maybe it's just the glass being half empty rather than half full. I don't know. But I think the Garden of Eden is a mixed bag, and I don't think it's the perfection that we thought it would be. And if it were, trends such as Linux and Apple wouldn't have gained the well-deserved foothold that they have. And how did this turn of events come about, we should ask? How did the personal computer turn out the way it has? Well, first of all, IBM dropped out of the race a long time ago. It forgot or never believed the lessons of the original PC, and it drove the spirit of innovation out of its Boca Raton operation and brought it back into Mother IBM, and it eventually closed the scientific centers, and it focused on the business user, and it reintroduced the closed proprietary mentality and failed when it tried to pioneer a PC operating system to replace MS-DOS in Windows, which was called OS/2. Anyone remember OS/2? IBM also rejected the Unix phenomenon and only recently has learned how to spell Linux. So the absence of IBM from the party spawned an orgy of hardware innovation by others, but it left the operating system and the PC persona to Microsoft. For IBM, the PC had become a junk business. Microsoft has become a captive of its large user base. It cannot make major changes for fear of either alienating or leaving behind all of those numerous customers. So, as Businessweek has even noted in this week's issue on Microsoft, it's become like IBM of the 1980s. And there's also a very human tendency to confuse commercial success with success. Nonetheless, this doesn't excuse Microsoft from trying and doing better. The PC phenomenon is fueled by business considerations. The hardware and the software houses that make up the PC industry are all trying to stay alive and to succeed commercially. And they do this by innovating and introducing new widgets, not by fixing things that are broken or are ugly or need attention or that Microsoft took back in the next release of their operating systems. So the entrepreneurial spirit is intimately a part of this funny mixed blessing that we've been commenting on, part solution and part of the problem. Apple has always been revered as a counterculture house that's gotten it right. Maybe so, but is Apple cutting that wide a swath through the computing world? Why have many campuses that embraced Apple early on made their pact with the devil of Microsoft? Is Apple a robust money-making enterprise or a cultural phenomenon? There are two sides to this equation, as you well know better than I do, and there are lessons to be learned. So there you have it. I've tried to do the minute waltz in the proverbial 50 seconds. We've covered a lot of ground, seen a lot of toys, and we've tried to see what forces the IBM PC set loose and what followed. What's been marvelous and what's been pretty ugly. And we've seen in technology many times where the originator or the pioneer fails to pick up the marbles. So we really shouldn't be too surprised that IBM's dropping the PC ball. Only amazed that it got in the game in the first place. I think IBM deserves full credit for launching an industry and a phenomenon which many others and ourselves have profited from. And likewise, Microsoft deserves great credit for getting so many of the horses which have come to the pond to drink again and again. But I think we all need to have some perspective and approach this modified Garden of Eden with some of the wistfulness articulated by Ted Kennedy when he invoked the spirit of his fallen brother Robert at his funeral in 1968. And he closed his eulogy by the remark, "Some men see things as they are and say, why? And I dream things that never were and say, why not?" And that's kind of the tone and the temper I'd feel a lot more comfortable with in the personal computing arena. If you have any questions, my airplane leaves in 4 minutes, so fire away.
Any questions? Back.
How much thought was given by IBM in 1980 to developing its own operating system? They went out to buy one. How much of a considered decision was that?
It was a no-brainer, Bill, and it was talked about a lot. And in fact, Don Estridge, who headed the personal computer business, had managed the operating system project for the mini computer I mentioned, the Series 1. And I remember when we reviewed that project, he told me about how much overtime his people had put in, and he kept saying, never again, I'll never get involved with software again. And then the next thing he knew, he was tapped to run the IBM personal computer business, and tragically he was killed in an airplane crash in 1981 or 2.
Chicago.
Yeah. So it was a no-brainer because everybody knew they would never meet the one-year edict with an in-house operating system. And just as an aside, I delayed the announcement of the IBM personal computer by a month. I went to Nicholas Katzenbach and turned in a bunch of my associates who I thought were leaking information to the street. And I signed an agreement every year that said we will not do that. And so I said, look, I think you should look into that because I think that's what exactly is happening, and one of our competitors is even alleging that. So they put the brakes on the whole personal computer announcement, and they delayed it from July to August. Nicholas Katzenbach, who was Bobby Kennedy's assistant, was our chief counsel then, and he called me and he said, we're going to announce the IBM personal computer tomorrow. I thank you for bringing the matter to my attention. We didn't find anything, well done, true and noble servant, thank you very much, click. What I didn't know at that time was Bill Gates in July of 1980 did not own the rights yet to MS-DOS. He was still negotiating them, and there's a PBS series called The Biggest Gambles, the business's biggest gambles, and that's one of them. And there's a lot of interesting people I work with who were interviewed in that. I never knew that at the time, but the delay of 1 month enabled Bill Gates to clean up his act, get the rights to MS-DOS. Well, hey, I don't think about it that way, but now that you're... Okay, so the long answer was it wasn't possible. Everybody would want to gold plate it and put multitasking in it and all this other stuff. And I would say Gary Kilduff lost the operating system derby because he wasn't hungry enough. And his wife told the IBM blue suits to get off their porch when they told her she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement when they showed up at the house. And she said, who are you? And they said, this is in a book called Big Blue, and it's absolutely true. So they just silently went back in their rental car and drove away, and that was the end of that. There was a question back there. Yes?
How's IBM positioning themselves, do you think, in the future with the fact that a lot of projections are that only 5% of network traffic is going to be computers, or it's going to be embedded systems, small, embedded technology, micros, and that kind of stuff. What's their game plan for the future?
Their game plan for the future is to keep growing this services and consulting business and software that may be associated with it, and to keep backing as far away from hardware business as they can possibly do. The one good thing that happened when IBM finally tanked was they did not kill the mainframe, and that became the cash cow that kept them alive. But most other hardware, including the PC, I think they view as what's sometimes referred to as a junk business. You can't make money at it, and let other people do it. We're in the high margin. We lust for the high margin businesses. And I think that's what they've become. Did that speak to your question?
I also see if they did try and get in the embedded systems with like cash registers and stuff like that over a period of time, but they don't have any plans on. They completely wiped out those business units.
One of the things IBM didn't really understand, we now know, is it really didn't understand consumers. It really didn't understand the civilian public. I mean, I used to see presentations and there would be mock-ups in the IBM boardroom of computer stores, and halfway through somebody say, wait a minute, we're IBM, what's this store? Get this thing out of here, Next thing you know, they're in the stores. Next thing you know, AT&T buys them, and on it goes. So there's been a little try this, try that, but in the end, where it touches the consumer, I don't think they've proven to know that game.
As I recall, one of the interesting things about that was really, that little micro was emulating a 360, wasn't it? And then they moved
now
the
you
APL from the mainframe down to
the Palm processor emulates a 360, and what runs on the 360 is the APL and BASIC interpreters. And that's the most convoluted thing you could possibly imagine. So the Palm microprocessor is extremely powerful. It had to be to munch its way through 360 code and APL and BASIC interpretation code. And knowing that, I used this as a development platform, and there was something that came out, the PC-AT 360, which was a 360 in the PC. And that development work was done in Cambridge, and it became a product, actually. And indeed, on the RTPC, the Unix workstation, and on the 390 mainframe, the 390 mainframe has been shrunk to a card and can fit in the Unix workstation as a coprocessor. I won't say they're roaring successes. They were, I think, commercial failures. But since you asked, yes.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think we should conclude here. We have refreshments upstairs in the seminar room, so if people want to, continue asking questions of Dick, that'd be great. And the 490 class has a date with a quiz, so we try to get them busy. But anyway,